Hello, global gardeners. Great to see you here on another Monday where we can talk gardening. What happened last week, what's happening this week, what we're going to do for the season. Today's emphasis is going to be on plants, how we choose our plants, and then we'll talk a little bit about companion planting and how that all ties in with your plant selection. Great to see everyone checking in. I want to give a special hello right off the bat to Jennifer Narden, who has signed up to be a member of the Gardener Scott community at the collaborator level. That's great, and there's lots of perks that come with that. It's great to have you aboard, Jennifer. Let's go ahead and get right to a question since we're going to be talking about plant selection and companion planting. That comes from Hot Pepper Paul, and he's wondering, do I need to be concerned about garlic and leek and onions in the same bed? And I do a lot of gardening like this, where you have plants that are similar, and so you put them in a bed. And when we talk about companion planting, one of the aspects of companion planting is to match their growing needs, how much water they need, how much sun they need, what kind of soil they need. So it makes perfect sense to grow alliums like garlic and onions together in the same bed along with leeks. They're very related to each other. They have very similar needs. There is a few concerns that I have. There are a few concerns I have about growing a number of plants like that are so similar that we put them all in the same bed. Essentially, it becomes a monocrop. And so even though garlic and leeks and onions are different, they're so closely related that they have the same pests that will attack them in most situations. If you have an onion pest, you shouldn't be planting garlic or leeks in that same bed. And so by putting all of those plants together, it's great as far as the maintenance of those plants, as far as growing them. But you do open yourself up to the possibility of losing everything if you have a particular pest that comes in. So if you have one of the weevils that attacks, or you have one of the caterpillars that attacks, and you're growing your leeks in a separate bed from the garlic, which is in a separate bed from the onions, you might lose some of the plants in one of the beds, and you're less likely to lose plants in other beds. And so that's one of those things to think about as we choose our plants and as we decide where to put our plants. I grow leeks and I grow onions and I grow garlic, but I grow them in different beds. Now, I'm lucky in that I don't have a lot of those pests that attack alliums. But if I do, that pest is less likely to find the cousin of the plant if it's in a bed on the other side of the garden. So, Paul, that's something to be concerned with. The plants are easy to maintain and easy to care for when you put them all in the same bed, but if you have a particular type of pest in your area that attacks one, I might suggest that you split them up just to kind of confuse the insects a little bit. So great to see everybody checking in. Greg Daner says that looks cold. This is a picture of my garden this morning, just a few minutes ago. We had just a little bit of snow last night. It was below freezing. Lots more snow on the way today. We're having a hard freeze tonight, a hard freeze tomorrow, and a hard freeze the day after that. And a hard freeze is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a little more than -2 degrees Celsius. And so I haven't been able to put out a lot of the plants that I might normally be able to put in. I'm only a week away from my last frost date, and we're still having this severe cold. And so when you get a hard freeze, that's much worse than just a frost somewhere around the frost date. So all those plants have been hardening off, are still sitting inside waiting to go out. But you can see the hardiness of some of the plants that I'm growing in my garden. In the far back, my garlic is doing great. I've got asparagus just over my shoulder. It's doing great. I have the rhubarb that's down low. I've got some currant that's down low. So all those plants that can handle cold, they're affected by a hard freeze, but not nearly as much. So hopefully by this time next week, I'll have some more plants in the ground because I'll be at that point where I'm at my last frost date, and let's hope that we don't have any frost past that point. So we'll see. Doris is saying good morning. Hi from Michigan. Gonna start hardening off plants today. Good for you. We had such good weather, and it was so warm that I started hardening off about 2 weeks ago, anticipating that maybe this was one of those years where the month of May was going to be extra warm and I could get plants in the ground sooner. But that didn't happen, as is typical in Colorado. The cold weather returned. And I did want to mention a little bit about this. We talked to some of the people on our Facebook group about hardening off because I had to postpone my hardening off. I had the plants out and I looked at the forecast, saw the cold weather was coming, and even though I'd already spent a week hardening off waiting for good transplanting weather, I brought my plants back indoors, put them in a nice warm area under lights, and I'll just wait until this cold retreats. So don't think that once you start the hardening off process, that if something goes wrong, that you have to continue with the hardening off process. If you start it and the weather turns terrible, well, go ahead and delay, put the plants back inside, and then start hardening off again. You have gained a little bit extra hardening off for those plants. So where normally I spend about a week hardening off, since these plants have already been exposed to the sun, and some of them I've actually kept overnight when the weather was warmer, they've been mostly hardened off. Now they're just waiting to be able to survive the cold temperatures within my garden. So when we do warm up again later this week, they're mostly hardened off. I'll put them back outside for a day or two, and then they'll be fine to get in the ground. So it is a bit a cumulative effect when you're hardening off because you're just trying to get the plants used to the outside. If they're used to the outside and then you have to bring them indoors for a day or two, they're not going to revert back to their tender indoor state. They're going to be mostly hardened off based on how long you've spent putting them outside. So I just had a bit of a delay in my process, and once it warms up, once this snow is gone, once the fog is gone, then hopefully I'll get back to gardening. Jay is saying, can I increase my volume a bit? Maybe I'll try talking a little bit closer to the microphone and see if that helps. Thanks. And so I wanted to get to another question that we had. Paul was asking about Milorganite. I've been talking about some different substances over the last couple weeks. I had not talked about that. That is a slow release fertilizer that's made from, I think it's freeze drying or heat drying microbes that are used in wastewater treatment. And there has been some discussion about whether it's human waste or not. And from what I've read, it's not human waste, but it is wastewater treatment. And that is an option as a slow release fertilizer. I have not used it, so I can't give you any specific recommendations one way or the other. But if any of you have used the Milorganite fertilizer, go ahead and share that in the comments, and we'll see what you all have to say about it. Nachi G is saying that she hears my pain, and it is one of those things that many of us throughout the country in the U.S. are encountering these kind of weather changes right now. We've got some really cold weather that's been rolling across the country in recent weeks and in this week, and it's so tough when we want to get out and garden and just can't get out there. But patience is a virtue, and if you wait and put your plants out at the best time for the plant, you'll have the best success. Not necessarily what's best for you, but what's best for the plant. And sometimes that means you have to wait for the weather to cooperate, and it can be discouraging, it can be very annoying, it can be painful, but that's the best way to have the success in the garden. Frank is saying it's supposed to be 34 here tonight. That's about 1 degree Celsius. Frank lives about 45 minutes south of me. Should I put my potato bags in the garage or just leave them be? And so you may have seen that I did a video on growing potatoes in potato bags that just came out this weekend. I am not putting my potato bags in the garage or in the shed, and I'm getting down to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The soil temperature has been pretty good. It's warm enough that when the seed potatoes are growing underground, they don't have that same issue with freezing conditions. So as long as the soil temperature is above freezing, they'll be fine. They might slow their growth a little bit. It's when the potato plant breaks the surface and starts growing that those leaves are susceptible to frost and those cold conditions. So for you and me, Frank, where we've just got a couple days of this, that's not going to be so cold that it's going to freeze the soil. And so that insulation of the soil, and I don't think you're getting snow, but I'm getting snow. The insulation of the snow on top of the straw that I'm using as a mulch in my grow bags will be fine to keep the soil warm enough for a couple days until those plants can really get a good level of growth. And by the time they break the surface and start growing, hopefully we'll be well past the last frost date and they'll be growing fine. Now, a lot of it depends on your plants. If you've got plants that are actively growing and they're tender plants that are susceptible to cold, then I would say go ahead and bring them inside. Now, as far as the potatoes in the bags, if your potatoes are actively growing, Frank, if you have leaves on them, then I would go ahead and bring them inside. But if they don't have the leaves, the soil will be enough to take care of it. And this is just one of those things most of us have to deal with when gardening in spring. The weather's going to change. It's going to get cold. That's an advantage of growing in containers and grow bags, is that you can bring them in and give them some extra protection on days like this when it's going to be extra cold. So it all depends on how much effort you want to take. And if it's worth saving the plant, then I say go ahead and bring them inside. If there's any doubt in your mind as to how cold it's going to get or whether the plant can handle the cold, how hardy the plant is, I suggest err on the side of caution. Go ahead and bring the plant into a protected area just to be safe. That's the way I do it. That's how I've learned which plants are hardy and which ones aren't, is by rolling the dice and thinking, oh, that plant can handle a little bit of frost, and then finding out that it really can't. So better safe than sorry. If there's any growth above the surface, bring those kind of plants in. Linda's saying, when you talk about soil temperature, is this measured at night or midday? Good question. And it depends on the plant. So for plants like peppers, for instance, where you have you're looking for a soil temperature of about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 21 degrees Celsius. So when you put the peppers in, the soil during the day should reach about 70 degrees Fahrenheit for those plants to really start growing well. But the nighttime temperature is best when it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit or more. That's about 10 degrees Celsius. And so we look at both of the factors. During the day, the temperatures aren't as important when it comes to putting them outside. It needs to be warm enough for the plants to survive. But it's really the nighttime temperatures that we're looking at during transplanting time and during the early life of the plants. It's the nighttime cold and it's the daytime soil temperature when we take our temperature measurements. Now, once the plants start growing and we get into summer, now the day temperatures do become a factor. And so during the day, if the temperature gets above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 32 Celsius, you're going to have some issues with pollination. You might have blossoms fall from the plant. The pollen may actually fall. It may not be able to, or it may not be viable. And so in very hot areas that are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit on a regular basis, you're probably going to see less fruit set on your plant. And that's because it's just too hot. And so it all depends on what the temperature is that you're measuring and why you're measuring it as to whether it's a daytime or a nighttime temperature. But do both and be aware that there are differences, that you can't just look at a single temperature during the day in spring and then gauge your entire growing season on that one temperature. It is something we have to keep up with and understand how it affects plants, both the soil temperature and the air temperature. So good question. Melissa Fallon, thank you for joining the Gardener Scott community as a member at the garden support level. I appreciate that. Good to see you here. Greg is asking, how many days of plus 90 degrees does it take to start impacting pollination? I don't know exactly. If we just have a day above 90, then any flowers that form on that day will probably be affected. But the flowers before that point that are hopefully already pollinated, and any flowers that come after that point have complete potential to be pollinated. And so you kind of have to look at it as a day-by-day process, because for most of the plants we're growing, just about all the plants, the pollen is going to, or the flower is going to open, and that pollen is going to be available for the pollinators on that day. And so when you have the male pollen that is transferred to the another flower or that same flower and fertilizes it, that pollen, both the male and the female parts of the flower, are really only viable for a day. And so when you think about 90-degree temperatures, the longer we have 90-degree days, the less fertilization is going to take place within our flowers. Now, there's a lot of other factors. It can be 90 degrees out, but if you've got your plants under some shade cloth, then they'll probably be pollinated. Those flowers might be okay. Or if it's just a momentary surge above 90 degrees, then it's okay, because those flowers may have been pollinated in the morning. So it's a moving window of time as far as when the pollen is available, when the flower is receptive to the fertilization by the pollen. There's a lot of other factors. But when you see a period of 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 days with high temperatures like that, that's when you start seeing problems with your fruit set. And I've seen that here in recent years, where we have had days. It used to be here in Colorado Springs, if a year had a temperature close to 100 degrees, it was extremely unusual. And in my first almost 20 years of living here, I think we had one day that was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 38 degrees Celsius. But in recent years, I think 3 years ago, we had 5 days that were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's definitely getting hotter. It's definitely affecting the plants more. And I've noticed that in my garden. When I have those days that are that hot on a successive basis, then I'm not getting the tomatoes to set, and I'm not getting the rest of the plants to set fruit. And that's just one of those aspects of understanding how temperature plays with the plants. Now let's turn this back a little bit to what I want to talk about today as far as companion planting. You can actually use your plants to benefit your other plants if you live in an area where you have excessive heat like that. And so normally when we talk about putting different plants in a bed, we talk about putting the tall plants away from the sun and putting the low plants closer to the sun, so that all of the plants get full sun and that the tall plants do not shade the smaller plants. You can actually shift this, turn it 180 degrees if you live in an area where you have excessively hot days. And now what you do is you place those tall plants closer to the sun so that they are shading the smaller plants. And that may give you extra fruit set if you're expecting the hot weather, because the taller plants are shading the plants behind it. Typically, especially if you're using a mulch and keeping the soil nice and moist, you have a cooler, more humid environment, and so those plants that are in the shaded area are more likely to have pollination in the morning when it's nice and cool. During the summer, they'll still have sun because the sun will travel directly overhead for the most part in most of our gardens. But if they can be protected earlier in the day and later in the day by a plant that shades them, you might be able to get some extra fruit set. And I've used this very successfully with some of my squashes because the squash pollen only lasts for a day. They'll open up in the morning, and if they get direct sun right away and it warms up very quickly, which sometimes happens here, then there's a very brief period where they can be pollinated by the insects. If they're in a shaded area, now I've expanded that window of opportunity for the insects to pollinate those flowers before it becomes too hot. So think about that as we start talking about plants and as you think about how you're going to put your plants together in same beds. You can turn it upside down. You don't always have to have the tall plants in the back of the bed. Eileen is saying, I heard someone spraying their plants with an aspirin solution. What is that used for? And so I don't have a video on that yet. Aspirin is used often in growing tomatoes. And so you might want to check out some searches as far as tomatoes and using aspirin. And it's one of those things that can cut down on some of the pest problems. And it's a treatment where, from what I've read, so I don't want to go too deep into this, but it can be effective. And so I want to do more research on before I make a video. But yes, it is something that can be done. There's a lot of home remedies that really have very little effect, but aspirin does show some promise. But I do need to look into that a little bit more before I give you some specific answers. Kevin's asking, growing lemon cucumbers and yard long beans on an arch trellis. I planted them close. Are these good companions? Yeah, they could be. And so this is another great reason to think in terms of companion planting when you select your plants. If you have a trellis set up for one plant, well, then consider growing another plant that can use that same trellis. And both squashes and cucumbers are plants that I grow on a trellis, and then I also grow beans on a trellis. Well, I did that last year. I did have some beans growing on the outside of the trellis, and I had some cucumbers growing on the inside of the trellis just to make sure that there was enough sun for all of their leaves. That's the thing to consider, is just as long as the plants are getting enough sunlight, by all means you can grow your plants together and call it companion planting. You can think of it in terms of like square foot gardening, where you break out your bed into individual areas and you grow different plants in those areas, whether it's 1 square foot or 4 square feet. It all depends on the plant. But most plants can grow side by side as long as you're giving them enough water, the soil has enough nutrition, and they get enough sun, either by spreading across the ground or on a trellis. And so one of the things I wanted to debunk, if you will, when it comes to companion planting, many people think of companion planting as pest control. And that is seen as the exclusive reason to companion plant, is you grow one plant because it deters pests from another plant. Or you're growing a plant because it is a magnet plant. It attracts pests away from another plant. And those are great reasons. There are fewer benefits than you might think. A lot of the evidence out there is that some of the pest control as it comes to companion planting is not as effective. There isn't a lot of research on it, but some of the university studies that I've seen show that some of the plants that we think are deterring pests, like marigolds, the smell of marigolds will keep pests away from your garden. Well, that really doesn't play out in laboratory studies. Now, marigold as a plant does have some beneficial properties when it comes to nematodes in the soil, but I think a lot of people are growing plants thinking that the fragrance or the aroma is enough to deter insect pests. And that just doesn't always hold true, especially as your garden gets bigger and you're making your selection for plants. So you can try it. There's nothing wrong with growing marigolds in your garden. They're great for attracting beneficial insects and pollinators. They're not that great at deterring aphids and other insects that you might be trying to get rid of. And so expand how you think about companion planting. And companion planting is really little more than just growing two plants side by side in a beneficial way. And like I was just talking about with the trellis, the plants don't necessarily have to help each other out. It just makes sense to grow them side by side. And that's the whole concept behind square foot gardening, where you can take a space in your garden, break it up into square foot sections, and then grow a whole bunch of different type of plants, because they all want the same basic sun and the same basic soil and the same basic water. And so you can get away by putting plants side by side in a bed. There might be some benefit, whether it's shading them out or attracting pollinators, but expand your vision of companion planting when you choose your plants. And one of the reasons I say that I'm debunking some of this is because I've been reading a lot. I've got a video coming out soon on companion planting, and I've been reading a lot about the different plants that are thought to benefit other plants. And what you'll find when you actually start comparing some of these books that are written about companion planting is you'll have one book that says you should plant carrots next to your tomatoes. And then one of the other books says you should never plant carrots next to tomatoes. And so because there's so little research on this and so much of it is anecdotal, we begin to think that, well, we read a book and it tells us to plant these plants side by side and they will benefit each other. That must be right because a book was written about it. Well, then you read a different book and it's just the complete opposite. Now who do you believe? Especially when there's no research to support either method. So I always suggest you try what works best in your garden. If you get the idea from a book, that's great, but think about why the plants are benefiting each other. And this gets back to my overreaching philosophy of a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And so if you're taking the effort to learn a little bit about companion planting, and if you're planting different types of plants in the same bed, chances are you're giving your plants the care that they need. And so it's just coincidence that the plants are growing side by side and both of them are doing great. The real factor is you. You as the gardener taking care of those plants is what's making them both grow the best that they can. And so I'm not a huge fan of companion planting as an end-all, where you look at the list and you choose your plants to match based on someone else's list in some other location in a completely different garden, and then you plan your garden around their recommendations. Take it as a suggestion, try it, see how it works, and then you create your own companion planting list in your garden journal for next year to find out what works best. Basil and tomato. I grow basil with tomatoes. Now, some of these books say that the basil will influence the taste of the tomato. So the reason you're supposed to grow basil with tomatoes is to make the tomatoes taste better. There's zero research to support that. I think instead, it's one of those things that the basil and the tomato like similar growing conditions. I grow my basil because I like to make a nice caprese salad with the basil and the tomato and some mozzarella cheese. And so when I go out and harvest my tomatoes, I can pluck off some basil leaves at the same time from the same location and then take them inside for a salad. That's companion planting, putting plants that have similar uses in the same spot. So that's one approach I take. But I don't grow my basil near my tomatoes because I think it's going to make either one taste better. I think it's just a coincidence that when we grow them together, that we as the gardeners are doing what we need to do to put two plants with similar growing needs in the same spot, and then we harvest them at the same time at the peak of their flavor, and then we eat them and love it and say, oh, that must be the reason why they did so good, is because they were growing together. Well, it's just a coincidence for a lot of that. Laura's saying one reason for tomatoes and carrots together is they both need deep watering. Only reason I know. There you go. That's exactly the thinking behind companion planting. They're not helping each other out because of any type of pheromones that they're releasing. They're helping each other out because of exactly what you point out. They have similar needs. They have long roots. They need more water. And so if you're giving your tomatoes enough water, then you're probably giving your carrots enough water if they're growing in the same spot. So I want to throw those things out. Well, we've got a lot more to talk about, but some extra things to think about when it comes to you becoming a better gardener is just not to take information at face value because there's a book written about it. Try to learn a little bit more and try to experiment and try to understand just exactly why things might be working and why someone is suggesting something in the first place. Philip saying, I built a few self-wicking tubs and I'm afraid the standing water on the bottom might cause mold growth. Do you know anything about problems people have with these tubs? That's actually one of the reasons that I don't use self-wicking tubs. Not so much because of the mold, more of it is because of the anaerobic bacteria that sets in. That's more of my concern. We here in Colorado often get some very heavy thunderstorms. And so the idea behind a self-wicking bed is you have a reservoir in the bottom that is filled with water, and the plant roots grow down to that point, and the water wicks up into the soil, so the soil stays moist, and the plant roots always have an ample supply of water. And when the soil begins to dry out, the water reservoir is continually replenishing the soil moisture. Well, because of our heavy thunderstorms with downpours, the few times that I've tried anything close to a self-wicking bed, what happens is the reservoir is always full. And then during a downpour like that, the soil becomes saturated. And there really isn't a good place for that water to go. In a self-wicking bed, you typically do have some drainage built in above or around the reservoir so that excess moisture can drain out of the bed. But what happens if you, like I do occasionally, have sustained rainy days during thunderstorm season? Well, that drainage is not enough. And so the self-wicking bed, the bottom of it is a reservoir that is not draining. And so that water just stays in the bed and stays in the bed. And there is potential for mold development. And there is potential for anaerobic bacteria development in the soil because that water is basically depriving the soil of any oxygen. And you can drown your plants in a self-wicking bed if you don't have enough drainage built into it. So that's why all of my beds are open on the bottom, or like in my metal beds, I've got the holes drilled in them so that the water can drain all the way out and it's not held within the bed. Now, if you don't have those issues, if you live in a hot region where you're not getting downpour thunderstorms like I do, self-wicking beds can be a lifesaver. They really are a way for you to not have to water as often and for the soil to stay moist for a longer period of time. But you just have to look at your own weather patterns and your own conditions to decide what method you want to go. But yeah, I do think mold could be an issue. And if you start seeing that develop, you might want to figure out a way that you can add some drainage to those beds just to try to mitigate that problem as much as possible. Shima from MS says, more than self-wicking beds, I like deep containers. The plants will find the extra moisture supplies and it won't stay wet enough to rot nor dry out super fast. I completely agree with you. And that's why I like raised beds so much, is because I have them high enough and the soil is good enough that it can drain out. And when I use the wood beds, the wood on the outside of the bed also helps wick away some of that moisture in those very wet conditions. So that is something to think about. I do want to mention, this was a very early question from Doll Peel, wondering about sawdust, having a lot of oak and maple logs and a lot of sawdust, and wondering if they can use the sawdust in the garden. And so the reason it jogged my mind, because I had written it down earlier, is when you are amending your beds, you should consider the organic matter in the soil. Now you may have seen my videos where I talk about hugelkultur, where I put logs when I fill my raised beds, and that organic matter breaks down and acts as big sponges for the water. And so especially in an area like mine, I don't use self-wicking beds. Instead, I use beds with a lot of organic matter where a reservoir would be, where a water reservoir would be. And so the wood is absorbing the water, but there's still enough drainage for excess water to go through. Sawdust is a great amendment when you're filling a bed. So I'll put sawdust lower in the bed because the wood takes longer to break down. It's decomposed by fungi rather than bacteria. And so it's one of those things that's going to be in the soil for a longer period of time. And so I've got bags of hardwood dust and use it mainly as a filler in my beds. I also use it in my compost pile. It is a nice carbon component, but it takes a longer time to break down. So I don't use a lot of it in my compost pile. I'll also mix it with leaves and grass as a mulch on top of the soil. Now the issue with sawdust, and if I have a lot of sawdust, that's why, or when I'll put it lower in the bed as a way to fill the bed, is because it can clump and essentially become just like a branch of a tree when you've got a whole bunch of sawdust. It takes a while for it to absorb moisture. It holds on to that moisture for a long period of time, and it blocks drainage to some degree. And so sawdust by itself is not a great mulch on the soil because it can create a barrier and actually can be compacted to the point that water will just run off and never make it to the soil. So that's why I mix it with other ingredients if I'm going to use it as a mulch. It also does take longer to break down, so I typically don't add just sawdust as a soil amendment, though you definitely can, especially if you've got a lot of fungal activity in your soil. You can go ahead and put the sawdust in the compost pile and then use all of that as a soil amendment when it comes time to amend your bed. So yes, absolutely consider using sawdust in your garden in one of these many ways that you can do it. Just avoid using it all at once so that you don't get that clumping, unless you want that clumping lower down like we've been talking about, that to help absorb moisture and act as a reservoir of moisture for the plants that you might have in your bed. Okay, let's see what it says. Progressive Update saying, Scott, doesn't organic matter in the soil rather than on the surface take nitrogen away from the decomposition process? Yes, it does. Fresh organic matter in the soil. So a compost that is decomposed or mostly decomposed is actually going to put nitrogen back into the soil. And that's one of the reasons why compost is among the best amendments, because it's not going to cause nitrogen depletion. If you put fresh materials, if you work in green grass, that is more of a nitrogen component, and so that doesn't have as much of a nitrogen depletion. But if you mix in dried grass, which is more of a carbon component, into your soil, then yes, there will be some nitrogen depletion because the nitrogen needs to balance with the carbon for it to be decomposed by the bacteria. That also happens with sawdust and other woody products. There is some bacterial decomposition. Most of that is fungal decomposition, and there's usually not as much nitrogen depletion in a fungally rich soil that has those wood products. But yes, that is a concern. And I've mentioned this in a couple of my videos. If I'm putting a lot of organic matter into a bed when I'm filling it, I will add fertilizer at the same time, a nitrogen-rich fertilizer to help offset the nitrogen needs of the bacteria to decompose all that organic matter. So a lot of it depends on just how decomposed that the organics are that you're putting into your soil. If they're fresh and they haven't decomposed at all, mix in some nitrogen fertilizer to help offset that depletion. Or do like I do in most of my beds, which is to amend in autumn so that there might be some initial nitrogen depletion as that decomposition begins, but once the material reaches an equilibrium stage of decomposition, it will start putting the nutrients back into the soil. And so it's hard to tell how long that'll be based on the moisture of the soil and the temperature of the soil and how bacterial and fungally rich your soil is, but that on the surface, yes, fresh organic matter can cause nitrogen depletion to a point, in which case it releases all of those nutrients from that organic material into the soil to benefit your plants. So there you go. Good point, Kevin. And I thought about it and didn't say it. You shouldn't really use sawdust from treated wood. Now, I do use pressure treated wood in my garden as the wood for the lower halves of my bed. In the United States, pressure treated wood is treated with a copper solution, and it hasn't been shown to be harmful for plants. Plants need copper in the soil to start with. There's very little leaching in most of the wood products that we would be using in our garden, and the copper that's in that wood really isn't going to leach into the soil and contaminate an entire bed. But those chemicals are still going to be in the wood and in the sawdust. And if you incorporate the wood from pressure, or the sawdust from pressure treated wood into your soil, now you are spreading some of those chemicals into the soil and you are becoming the leaching agent basically. And so it's not advisable to use pressure treated wood sawdust in your soil. I have I had a test bed once where I put a small amount of pressure treated sawdust. I saw zero effect on my plants. And so I don't think that there are enough chemicals, and I don't think the chemicals are harmful enough that it's really going to harm the plants. I haven't seen it in my own anecdotal evidence of a small experiment. But just to be safe, I suggest anything that is chemically treated, try to keep it out of your soil, because it might not necessarily harm the plants, but it might not be beneficial for some of the soil microbes that would be consuming that material. And that might be more of an issue if you've got that copper-based sawdust in your soil. It might harm some of those microbes. So I think that's more of a reason to avoid it than because of any harm that it might cause to your plants. So there you have. Let's see if you try it and want to see the results, let us know about it. But I think it's best just to stay away from it. Vanessa's saying my compost bin got up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's fantastic. That's exactly where you want it to be, and now it's around 140. That's awesome. When you get a pile that high, you can kill weed seeds, you can kill pathogens, you can kill all the bad bacteria. That's awesome. That's definitely a hot compost pile. So congratulations to you, Vanessa. I think that's awesome. Melissa is saying tomatoes and cilantro are totally fine together based on my experience. The shade of the tomatoes helps keep it from bolting too early, but it will still bolt eventually, at least where I live. I agree with you. And actually, that's another plant I grow with my tomatoes because I like to grow a salsa garden. And so I like to save effort when I harvest And so if I'm going to make a salsa, it's so much easier for me to go out and harvest some tomatoes, and right at the base of the tomatoes are the cilantro, and I'll go ahead and pull cilantro at the same time. And if you look very closely at a couple of my videos last year in my brand new metal bed, and I was showing making some trellises and I was growing some tomatoes, you might actually be able to see cilantro growing at the back of those beds. And so I lined those beds with cilantro plants and I was growing tomatoes in all those beds as well. So I completely agree with you. Great combination, and I do think it's exactly what you point out. The shade from the tomato helps the cilantro uh, in bolting, even though the cilantro will bolt when it gets hot enough. But for me, it's just easy to go out and harvest everything at the same time. Okay, Melissa Sullivan, seriously, best show ever. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I always try to make every show the best show ever, so I like it and I appreciate that kind of feedback. Thanks so much. And I do want to give a shout out. There's Jay Dixon again giving her reminder for the support. Both Jay and Heidi, I haven't seen Kiri check in yet today, but we have great moderators on this channel. We have great viewers and participants on this channel. And this live stream is just an example of that. You all are an amazing group of gardeners, and that's why I just love my Mondays and the time I can spend with you all here. We're at 325, which is a great number. Some of the discussion before we came on the air was about Mark's recent live streams of Self-Sufficient Me and just how crazy they got. And I started watching one of them. Mark is just filled with information. Most of you probably watched some of his videos from the Self-Sufficient Me channel. And it's great, enjoyable, wonderful videos. But he's got over 1 million subscribers. And when you get to that point, if you don't have the moderators, and if you don't have such a great audience like you all are, things can go a little crazy. And the remarks in his live stream with the trolls and just the people that were just not appropriate, it was sad for me to see, and it really made me appreciate all of you, and it made me really appreciate Jay and Heidi and Kiri in particular as moderators during this live stream. So I know many of you give them kudos and a pat on the back each week, but they are one of the reasons why this is such a great opportunity on Mondays for all of us to get together and have civil conversations, ask questions, answer them without the spammers and the trolls jumping in. It's happened just a couple times, and Jay and Heidi are right on top of it. So thank you so much again. I know you all appreciate it. It's all of us working together to make this a good spot to come and ask questions and get information, and it's not a good place for the trolls and the spammers, and we will continue to work to keep it that way for you, and it's through the help of Jay and Heidi and Kiri that are doing that. So give a shout out to all of them because they're just doing a wonderful job. I could do this without them, but it wouldn't be as successful and it wouldn't be as enjoyable experience for you. So once again, just a great opportunity for all of us to get together. Jay says, I tried to give Mark advice a week before that first live stream of Self-Sufficient Me. And I saw that. I do appreciate Jay. Is just so wonderful at keeping all of us, all of we creators on track and the whole gardening community globally on track. So that was a nice effort of yours. I hope Mark does find a group of people that he can put in his live stream as moderators to help out. And I think, I'm guessing, I certainly do not want to take credit, but I've noticed a number of pretty successful gardening channels that have started live streams just within the last month or two. And I would like to think that it's because of us, that we play one small part, that our live stream is so successful, you guys are so great, that these other creators want to emulate it, and they want to copy what we have. And it's a growing process. I've been doing this for over a year now, and I hope them all success, and I hope they figure it out, because a lot of the people that are trying it are really good gardeners with some good channels with some good information. And so I'm touching base on live streams with a lot of these other channels as well. But I still think we've got the best, and I still think we've got the best moderators. So I'll stick with that and move forward with it. And I think the others have a high bar to match if they're going to try to get to the Gardner Scott global audience and even have a small portion of the great people that we have here. So thank you, all of you, for making it wonderful. Philip Warren, thank you so much for that contribution today. I appreciate that. Super chat, and you as well, Pat Patrick. It's so nice to see you all here every Monday, and we can talk gardening. Isn't this wonderful? I love it. And so Nguyen Chan is saying, when will you invite Jay and Heidi onto the show so we can put word to face? So I had actually communicated with them months ago, and I did intend on doing that. I've been having some problems with the software that I used when I had Tony on the show and when I had Scott on the show. And so I've been trying to figure out those software issues. I think it might actually be a camera issue. And so I've told both Jay and Heidi that I would like to have them on the show at some point, and I do look forward to that. I just need to figure out the software issues, and I've been so busy getting my garden ready and with videos and everything else that honestly I haven't focused much of my attention on fixing that software. This software is actually a different software, and I can't have people on the show with this software that I'm using right now. But this software also has some sound issues that we've seen in recent weeks. So I'm still trying to figure it all out. Once I get my garden planted and I can devote more time to this, hopefully we'll get back on track. And Jay and Heidi, you've heard it. They want to see you and they want to hear from you. So we will definitely plan that on a future date. So good. Thanks for that suggestion. Masabi Gal's asking, I'm planting plum trees soon. What's the best pruning shaping method on plums? Now, it depends on plums. There's a couple different types of plums. European plums, Japanese plums. Depends on how big the trees are going to be. I've had very good success growing European plums with a central leader. And so that's basically one main trunk and then branches growing off from that. And I had a semi-dwarf plum tree. I think it was a Stanley plum, and it did great with that particular method. Now I've also used the open center or vase method for plums, for smaller trees that I kept pruned to be shorter and that I could harvest better. Because the central leader method, I had to, even with a semi-dwarf tree, I had to take my ladder out to harvest some of the plums that were growing higher up. And so I found that the open center method can give you just as many plums, but it can be easier to harvest if you prune your tree to be shorter. So a lot of it depends on how tall you want your tree to be, which type of plum it is, and what shape you prefer. So I've done both. I would say, especially if you're growing two, if it's something that you really want to experiment with, do one with a central leader and do one with the open center and do a comparison. And then if you expand in the future to other fruit trees, then you can get a really good idea. Another one of those things, you could do it the way I say to do it. There's some really good videos out there about pruning fruit trees. The Wilson Nursery in California, they've got some good videos on pruning fruit trees. And they discuss that as well, as to the different types of plants or different types of trees and different types of pruning and the results that you can expect. So hope that helps a little bit. I know it wasn't a hard answer because I've done both, but think about which you might like as for the shape of the tree, and then you can prune them accordingly. Robert Matner says, Gardner Scott has a suggestion, contact Steady Trade Podcast with Tim Bowen for his process to feature other presenters. Thank you. When when I was working with Tony O'Neill and Simplified Gardening channel, and we did some work together. We did some comparing of softwares and found one that worked for both of us. Was easy to use, but don't know about steady trade. So thank you for that suggestion. I'll look into it because I do plan on doing more, and I know I'm going to have to invest in a new camera and new software. I've been trying to get by with less expensive methods, but I know just to give you the quality that you deserve, I'm going to have to invest in some more things. So I appreciate that suggestion, and I will look into that. Nachi's saying, thank you so much, moderators. It's too bad that happens to Mark, but like you say, it's understandable. Thank you all. Very appreciative of your hard work. Absolutely. Like I said, we all are very appreciative of what they're doing. And so let's talk a little bit more about plant selection, because even though some of us have snow on the ground and we're not putting plants in right now, I'm still laying out all my seed packets. I'm still thinking about where I'm going to put my plants, which ones are going to go together. And if you haven't done that yet, I strongly suggest you try to come up with a plan before you go out. Now, if you garden like I do, the plan is flexible. And so I'll plan to put 8 different salad crops in a bed with 2 rows of each, and I'll take all 8 out into the bed, and then I start putting the seeds in, and I look at the space and think, well, instead of 2 rows of beets, maybe I'll do 3 rows of beets. And by the time I get done with the bed, now I've got a packet or 2 of seeds that didn't end up going in that bed. So that's okay. It's okay to be flexible during the actual sowing and planting process. But at least I had an idea going out to the garden as to which seeds I was going to put into the bed. And back to the whole concept of companion planting, which is just put plants together that will grow well together. And that's where that planning before you go out to the garden comes in to play. Lay the seed packets out. Lay the pots of plants out. When I'm transplanting into my beds, I'll actually take the pots and put them on the surface of the bed before I put a single plant in. I lay everything out ahead of time and stand back and think, okay, is this really what I want in this bed? Are they adequately spaced? Is there something else I can put in this bed as well? Because like we were talking about earlier with the onions and the leeks and the garlic, are we inadvertently creating a monocrop, basically all of the same kind of crop? And one of the reasons I like to think this way when it comes to companion planting is because put yourself in the brain of an insect, which is extremely small. But you're flying around looking for something to eat if you're an insect pest. And you see this big flashing light, allium bed, allium bed, allium bed. And you go down and you munch. And you have a field day going from plant to plant and laying your eggs. And then the larva will eat the roots. And you as a gardener are trying to figure out, how can I deal with this pest? Well, one of the ways to deal with the pest is to break up your plantings. And so, like we talked about earlier, rather than putting the leeks and the onions and the garlic in the same bed, put some garlic in one bed, and also in that bed grow something else that has similar needs, like another root crop, like a carrot or a beet. Now you've got all roots in the same bed that have similar water needs, but they're not all from the same family, so they will have different pests. And you do the same thing with the leeks, and you do the same thing with the onions. You spread them around your garden. Now, think of yourself as that insect flying over a garden, and you've got that little puny brain. You look down, you don't see the big flashing sign that says, here's a bed filled with alliums. You see little bits of light. You think, oh, that looks like that might be onions down there. And you fly down, and if you're an onion pest, you find some onions and you start munching away, and you might cause some damage, but you as the gardener can see the pest hopefully early enough and deal with it so it doesn't become a problem. And by you dealing with it, well, that pest never finds the garlic and never finds the other plants in your garden because you've split them up. Back to the square foot gardening idea, back to the idea behind companion planting that I like is grow different plants side by side to confuse the insects. And I think this might be where some of that anecdotal evidence comes in, where, oh, if I'm going to grow this plant next to the other plant, all of a sudden I have fewer pests. It must be because this plant deters pests from the other plant. Or, because I think that isn't completely proven, or it's because you've just confused the pest to the point that they're looking for a particular plant and the pheromones, the color, all of those other aspects that the plants use to communicate is disrupted. When you've got a basil growing next to a tomato, well, the insects get confused. They're looking for a tomato, but they smell a basil. Or they're looking for a basil, but they don't see the basil because the tomato blocks their vision. Those are kind of the factors I think that we should think about when it comes to companion planting. Not because one plant helps the taste of another or one plant deters pests from another. I think it's just an overall environment that we create. We're attracting beneficial insects because we're growing grasses and herbs and a lot of the flowers that are attracting beneficial insects. The pests come in and they're confused. They might find one or two of our plants, but because we've got beneficial insects in our garden, they're going to pounce right on top of one or two of the pests as soon as they show up. So they can never get a foothold in our garden because we've dispersed our plants and we've attracted the predatory insects so that when the bad bugs come in, we take care of them right away. And so that's how I ran the Galileo School Garden. And as I mentioned before, in the 4th year that we were growing, once we started dispersing our plants among all the different beds, and we had over 100 beds, and once we started growing those plants to attract the beneficial predatory insects, we had virtually no pest damage on our plants in that 4th year. And going into the 5th year, I don't even know that I saw any of those pests that had been an issue in previous years. So that's one of the big things I wanted to get out to you today, and the concept of choosing our plants and putting them together in such a way that they benefit each other. They're good companions for each other. And one of the ways to do that is just to break things up a little bit before you even get out to the garden. And I'm guilty of this. I like planting all my tomatoes in a row on a trellis. I like growing a group of tomatoes in a bed all at once. I don't put one tomato in one bed and one tomato in another bed. I do group plants. That's okay. Just if you're going to group plants, don't put all of them in one block. Try to separate them out a little bit. And so like at the school garden, that's what we would do. I would grow 6 or 8 tomato plants in a single 4-foot by 8-foot bed. And then I wouldn't have another bed with tomato plants in it for 12 or 15 feet. And in between, there would be 2 or 3 other beds that were planted with peas and beans and squash and everything else. Again, just to confuse the insects and to break up the garden into a quilt so that it's lots of little squares of plants rather than one big blanket of plants. So that's how I approach it. Just I think something that you all might want to consider if you haven't done it before moving into this season. Okay, Chris Dixon, thank you so much for those kind words. I appreciate that. When Ive says, cool, everything else looks great. It has uber tomatoes on it, but it looks like a weed. Okay, I think that's maybe something else you were responding to, but I'm glad to hear that everything's looking great. Tamara's saying, I learned from this live stream to plant alliums in different beds. I didn't know the benefit of that. Good. I'm glad that you learned something from that. That's why I'm here every Monday helping you out. Jay's saying, I like to split my plants similar to a quilt with block of similar items in various locations. There you go. The quilt rather than the blanket. And I continue to do that with all my plants. Now, I've been growing lavender from seed for a year now. And I did put some lavender plants in the ground this last week because I think they can handle this cold. I didn't put everything in the ground. I kept some behind just because the snow and the cold coming, and I did kind of a little bit of an experiment to see if the lavender will survive a hard freeze soon after transplanting. But I do that with even those plants that I'm trying to attract the beneficials with. And lavender has a lot of benefits in the garden. It's beautiful. You can eat it. It does attract some good insects, some pollinators. And so I put in clumps of 3 or 4 lavender plants. And I've done that a few different areas of my garden, like a quilt. And so if I really wanted to attract the insects that lavender plants attract, I'd plant a whole field of lavender. But instead, like you, I do the quilt approach so that when an insect discovers my garden, they're not going to come in and say and land on a pea plant and go, oh, this garden sucks. I was looking for lavender, but all I found was peas. No, they're likely to land on the pea plant, stick up their little insect nose, and say, oh, I smell lavender. There must be lavender around here somewhere. And then the insect finds the lavender. So it works both ways for the beneficials and the harmfuls. But I agree. I think a quilt is a good way to go. James is saying, if I grow my tomato plants in smaller pots, like 10 inches, will they only grow so big and still produce, or will they get stressed at capacity and die? I've only have one video where I actually show this, and it's actually a tomato video, one of my older videos. But I have a video where I show how to transplant tomato plants from one pot to a bigger pot. And at one point in that video, I'm in the greenhouse, and I show that where I've kept some plants in the little individual cells in the tray, and the same plant from the same tray I put into pots, and it's crazy the difference. A plant will grow to the size of the pot. So if you keep any plant in a pot that's too small, it will stunt the growth. It will only grow to the size that that pot can support. If you put it into a bigger pot, it will grow bigger and be a healthier plant. And so that's the only video that I have right now where I actually show a side-by-side comparison, is in that tomato transplanting video. But the choice is yours. It all depends. If you're going to continue to grow in containers, I would say transplant into a bigger container. If you're just waiting, like me, for the soil and the air temperatures to increase so you can put it outside, then the smaller pot for an extra week or two really won't pose much of a problem, especially if you can plant the tomatoes deeper when you put them out into the garden and get some of that extra root growth along the stem. Al Johnson saying, on the western slope of Colorado, I've had a lot of difficulty with growing herbs. This year I started basil indoors and will transplant it out this week. Any tips on herbs here? In Colorado, it is just so dry. Now, you're on the western slope, so you do get more moisture than those of us along the Front Range. But throughout the state, our humidity is just so high that you have to take that into account. So some herbs, like lavender and rosemary, can actually do pretty well in a Mediterranean environment that's relatively dry. But then you have other plants like basil that really likes more moisture and a more humid environment. And so one of the ways to have success is to try to match the plant with the environment. And so again, reason why I grow basil near my tomatoes is because the tomatoes shade the basil, and because I'm watering deeply for the tomatoes, that's ample water in a more humid environment, even in dry Colorado, for my basil. But I'm growing my thyme and my oregano and my sage all out in the open, along with the tarragon. Those are all plants that don't need a humid environment. So I grow them all in a border bed that's mulched well, because our soil dries out very quickly as well. So if you live in an area where you have dry conditions, where your soil dries out faster than without a mulch, uh, it's a no-brainer for using mulch, especially in an herb bed. And so that's one of the things I do here in Colorado is mulch well around my herbs, try to match them with the humidity levels and the sun requirements. And I've had great success. I've been growing them dill. I love growing dill. It literally grows like a weed. It's called dill weed on some seed packages, and it's because it grows so well. And it will reseed this year. I haven't seen it popping up yet, but I'm expecting to get some dill in certain areas of my garden as soon as it warms up from just all the seed that I let scatter last year when the plants went to seed. So for all of you, whenever you're growing any plant, especially the herbs, just make sure you're trying to match the soil, the mulch, the sun, the shade, and the plant, and you'll have better results that way. I've got a whole bunch of basil. I think I've got five or six different types of basil, and I'm going to be putting them out in a basil bed. I actually went shopping for a metal bed. You may have seen my video about the easiest raised bed ever, where I took some animal stock tanks and drilled some holes, put soil in, and that's where I've got one of those is with horseradish, one of those is with mint, so that the roots can't escape out of the sides or the bottom. And I wanted to get some more of those metal tanks to use as beds and paint them and grow some basil in one and grow some nettle in the other. But the cost of these beds is just skyrocketed. I think it's probably because of everything this last year. Prices are higher, but I'm having to reevaluate what my plan is for some of the beds in my garden just because the costs are so high. I've been looking at doing a greenhouse this year, and I was going to build a wooden greenhouse with my own design, and then show you how I did it. Well, the cost of wood is so high that now I'm looking at buying a kit that has the metal supports, because the cost is comparable and the metal does just as well. So I'm guessing you're having some of those same issues when you're looking at some of the materials that you're going to use in your garden. Is the costs are just so high. And so expect more videos from me this year as I show you some of the ways I'm going to be saving money in the garden, just because some of the things I had planned aren't going to come to fruition this year because it just costs too much. For those beds where I want to put the basil and the stinging nettle, I'm going to do stone beds, because I can build a stone bed for less than I can build a wooden bed right now with the way the costs are. So expect to see that video as well. I don't have a video yet on building a stone bed, but I made that decision this weekend. So I'm going to have to get some stone, build some short raised beds, and then get my basil in the ground, because it'll be ready to transplant here once we get past the last frost date. So anyway, just some thoughts to think about. Dustin says, I have struggled to get tarragon seeds to start. What's your recommended procedure? So I started my tarragon indoors, and I had great success with it. And I started it in just my standard peat-based seed starter mix in cells. And then I transplanted them into, I think, 3-inch pots with just the basic potting soil blend that I've shown in my videos, where I take peat and compost and perlite and a little bit of worm castings. And then I grew it under lights. That's how I grew my tarragon. Then I transplanted it outside. I have tried to grow tarragon from seed directly in the garden, and maybe like you, if that's what you've been trying to do, I didn't have much success with it. But I had great success, good germination rates when I did it indoors and treated it just like peppers or tomatoes or anything else that I'm starting from seed. The key is just get it going, put it under lights, and don't overwater it, and it did fine. Drawing Momentum is saying, I have a sick 15-foot tree I can't identify. The top branches won't grow leaves and seem dead. It has smooth bark with oval serrated leaves. Can I just prune it off uh, all the top dead branches? And so oval leaves could be a couple things. It might be an elm tree. It could be an aspen tree. There's a lot of plants with oval leaves. There's some good sites that you can go to identify trees, and do a search like tree identification and photos, and see if you can find something like that. But a lot of it depends on the tree. Generally, most of the trees that are growing in our landscape are growing with that central leader design, or pruning method, or just the natural way that the tree grows. And so what happens is the tree's going to grow from a central trunk. And if you cut off the top, then you're cutting off that growth point, and that trunk will not grow any taller. What will happen is some of the side branches will attempt to take over that function and become the central leader. And so, yes, if the top of the tree is dead, you can prune off those dead branches. You can also attempt to train some of the side branches to take over the role of that central leader. First, I would suggest trying to identify the tree, and then that'll give you an idea of its growth. You can find some good pictures. You might be able to find some information about pruning those kind of trees. But if you've got dead or diseased branches growing on a tree, there's no reason to keep them on a tree. You should go ahead and cut them off. Just be careful about blatantly cutting everything at the top, because some of those branches that could become a central leader, if you cut their tips off, they're going to stop growing. And now they're going to send out a new bud, and that new bud might become a central leader at some point, but you're wasting a lot of time by doing that. So do be selective in how you train a tree and how you prune a tree, but you can definitely take advantage of how trees grow to your advantage if you have to do some heavy pruning. Tamara's saying, is it okay to plant flowers about 2 feet away from my new grapevines? Will it take nutrients away from what the vine needs? Yes, it's okay. And no, it probably won't take nutrients away. I was very lucky with my wife many years ago now, probably close to 10 years now. We went to France and toured vineyards in France. And one of the things about grapevines is they can have extremely long roots. And so some of those grapevines in France have been measured over 100 feet deep. Most of the old vineyards are at least 50 feet deep with the roots growing. And so chances are your grapes are going to send down some very deep roots. And there aren't any flowers that are growing that deep. So yeah, go ahead and do it. And in fact, in many of the vineyards in France, they have rose bushes that are growing at the head of many of the rows of grapes. And back to the idea of companion planting. This is a great example of companion planting. The roses are growing at the front of the row of grapes. The roses don't improve the flavor of the grapes. They don't do anything for the grapes. The grapes don't do anything for the roses. But the insects that are going to attack the grapes will attack the roses first. And so the vine or the vineyard owners are using roses as like a canary in the coal mine. They're using roses as an indication of how healthy their vineyard environment is and whether there are any insect pests that they need to deal with. And so yet another reason to put different plants in your garden depending on what your pests are, because like in France, you might be able to use roses to give you a heads up as far as pests that might be coming to harm your grapes. But as far as putting flowers near your grapes, go for it. You're going to have very few issues. And those flowers might actually be attracting some of the beneficial predators that will deal with any of the pests for the grapevines that you're growing. So good question, and good something that you should consider. Okay, let's see. Drawing Momentum is saying it has an open base shape and it's not aspen or white bark. Okay, that's helpful. So if it has an open base shape, that does give you a lot more latitude when it comes to pruning off the dead branches at the top. I've got some pruning videos, a couple of them where I show how I prune my fruit trees, and the key factor is identifying a healthy bud and then pruning back to that bud, because that bud will become the new branch and potentially the new leader of those different segments of that base shape. So hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier for you. So Lisa's saying, I saw a kit for a greenhouse on Facebook for only like $25. Doesn't sound legit to me. Doesn't sound legit to me either. One of the things, since I shifted my plan for the greenhouses, we get extremely high winds and some heavy snows, and so I'm having to look at greenhouses that can actually handle the conditions in my garden. And so I'll be talking more about this when I do that video, but you do need to match the greenhouse with your weather, because yeah, I've seen $15 greenhouses that are sold at some discount stores, and they're basically just real slender plastic or light aluminum tubing that's covered with a really light plastic. There's no weight to it at all. They're pretty small, and at least in my region of the world, they would blow away and end up in Kansas if I attempted to put anything like that in my garden. So you do have to match what you want with what you have, and I don't think a $15 greenhouse, it might be legit, but if it is legit, if that is the cost and you do get a greenhouse kit, it's not going to be very big and it's not going to be very small, and it's probably going to be a waste of your time and energy. So instead, put your time and energy and money into something that's actually going to work and not blow away or collapse if you have a big storm that causes some disastrous conditions like that. Okay, Lisa's saying, I've never understood not being able to collect rainwater. Here in Colorado, and there are a few other western states that have this issue, until just a few years ago, it was illegal for us to collect rainwater. And so for those of you in the world where you've got barrels and you're collecting rainwater, and maybe you have a big pond that collects the rainwater and you water from that, and that's your main irrigation source, that was illegal in the state of Colorado. Now, a couple years ago, they changed the law, so now we can actually have 2 rain barrels and collect rainwater that way. But beyond that, we can't. And a lot of it, most of it, actually comes down to the water laws here in the western United States. The water that falls from the sky falls on land, and that landowner owns that rainwater. When it flows into a stream, and then the stream flows into a river, well, all along the way, different ranchers or farmers or gardeners have to lease the rights of that water from the person that it belonged to. And a lot of those rights go back well over 100 years. And so that's the issue, is that for many of us that live in an urban environment, the rainwater that falls doesn't belong to us as a landowner because of the way the laws are written. That rainwater is assumed by the state to either percolate through the soil into aquifer, or to run off into a stream or a river. And somebody else downriver owns that water that falls on our rooftops. I know it's kind of crazy for those of you that don't live in a region like this, but that's the law. That's the way it works. And it's reached the point now for those people that live in Arizona and Nevada and California, they own the rights to some of our water, but we've taken back some of those rights here in Colorado. So that's a whole nother issue that's going through the courts right now. It is crazy. Just because rainwater falls in the United States doesn't mean you own that rainwater. And you do have to be careful about collecting it and understanding what the laws are in your area. It's crazy. It's funny. It's a funny story, and then we'll get to the philosophy. So when I was at the Galileo Garden, I taught a number of classes to the community, and we offered free gardening classes, and they were pretty well attended. A lot of people, a lot of good information like this. Every time I would do a class, it'd be for about an hour and a half, and these live streams are an hour and a half. So imagine during the spring, instead of watching me on Mondays, you would come to the school in the auditorium, and I would teach a class with slides on different topics. And so in one of these classes, we were talking about preparing the garden and water needs, and I raised the issue about rain barrels and how here in Colorado it was at the time illegal to use rain barrels. But I said, I know many gardeners who have rain barrels, and you can do it, just be aware it's against the law. But the rain police, or I said, the water police are not going to come to your backyard because you have a rain barrel and fine you. And a woman in the back of the room raised her hand, so I called on her, and she said, coincidentally, I am the water police, and you're right. And it was funny. It's a woman that I got to know fairly well, and she actually helped volunteer at the garden, and that was her job with our local utilities company. Is she was in water management, in the watershed management, and one of her roles was to deal with people who were stealing water. And what she shared with me later was they've got ranchers and big farms that are stealing water based on the laws of the state, and they're not going to waste their time on a homeowner that has a barrel that they're saving rainwater for their garden. So I'm not telling you to save water if it's against the law in your area, just letting you know, having actually talked to the water police, they've got bigger culprits on their hands than a gardener who might be trying to collect a little bit extra water for their garden. So, bet you haven't heard that story before. So, let's get to the philosophy point. I came across something that I thought was interesting. It's a quote from Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve was an American actor who became famous decades ago as Superman and died a few years back. But the quote resonated with me. And it's, you've got to give more than you take. And so I think it's a great lesson for life in general. You've got to give more than you take. But when I read it with the mind of a gardener, I started thinking about the garden and the soil and how we garden, and thinking of it with that basic philosophy as well. You have to give more than you take. And when we talk about taking from our garden, we can talk about many, many different things. We can talk about the harvest. We can talk about the enjoyment. We can talk about the hobbies that we're doing that are gardening related. There are so many things that we're taking from our garden. But it's helpful to not lose sight of what we have to give to our garden to be able to take from it. And I've talked about this many, many times, about feeding the soil to feed the plants. If you're not feeding your soil and you just keep putting plants in, and the plants keep taking the nutrients from the soil, well, eventually you're going to run out of nutrients, and the plants are going to have nothing to take, and you won't have a harvest. So for you to have a harvest, because your plants are growing well, you have to feed your soil. You have to give your soil something. I prefer to give it organic matter rather than a chemical fertilizer. But whatever it is you give your soil, you've got to give your soil something so the plant can grow, so that you can get the harvest from that plant. That holds true across the garden. For you to get a harvest, you've got to water your plants. You've got to spend time with your plants. You've got to learn about your plants. You have to make the effort. You've got to take the time. Without the time and the effort, you're not going to have the success, and you're not going to be able to take back from the garden. So the lesson for today in this bit of philosophy is analyze a little bit, spend some time, sit in your garden, stand in your garden, observe your garden from all sides, and start thinking about what are you giving to your garden? What are you giving to your soil? What are you giving to your plants? What are you giving to the beneficial insects that hopefully you want in your garden? What are you giving to the animals, assuming you want some wildlife in your garden? What are you giving them? I've had many gardeners over the year, mainly through my classes, some here on the Gardener Scott channel, who say, I'm doing this in the garden and I'm not getting the results I want. So why aren't I getting the beneficial insects? Why aren't I getting the good harvest? Why is it not working? And it always comes back to, well, what are you giving? What are you doing? What's causing that problem? And it may be as simple as they just didn't take the time to think about what their garden needs and what they can give it, more than what they're giving it right now. Because our garden will always want more. And so you've got to decide what the garden needs as opposed to what it wants, and then what you've got the ability to give. And if your garden isn't doing as well as it should, maybe it's because you're just not giving it enough. There's been many years where I was growing the garden and I wasn't giving enough. And so at the end of the season, after a whole 3-4 months of effort, I didn't get the harvest. And it often was because I didn't feed the soil adequately, I didn't water enough, I didn't protect the plants from the weather, I didn't give the plants what they needed. And so why should I be expected to take from that plant when it doesn't have enough for itself? It certainly doesn't have enough to give me. And so certainly think about this as a way to approach life, but also think about it as a way to approach your garden. All around you, what else can you give? What else can you do? What else can make a difference in your day that will have some benefit, that will have something that you can take back? And all of us as gardeners, I think, are giving people. Overall, we're just nice people, and we want to share. We want to give. We want to be a better part of the world. And I think the garden is a great place to start with that philosophy. Give your plants something extra and then extend that same basic philosophy to the rest of your life. But as you're choosing your seeds, as you're choosing your plants, as you're figuring out what's going to go in the beds, look beyond just the plant and right now and think about the rest of the season. What can you give that plant? What can you give that bed? What can you give your garden? What can you give the world so that it all works out to the point that you can take from it and that you can benefit from it? And I think if we look at it that way, we'll have a much better gardening season in addition to having a better life overall. So there you have it. There's a little bit of philosophy for your Monday. I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm hoping the weather clears up soon and warms up so I can get my plants outside and I can get back outside. And those of you that are encountering some of these terrible spring weather conditions, I hope it improves for you too. It's always nice to have you here on a Monday. I look forward to seeing you here next Monday, same time, same place. Thanks for your cooperation. Thanks for your support. And thanks for just being a gardener. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.